Tony Bellew gains revenge over Nathan Cleverly with a 12-round split decision win. This fight started off very slowly. Tony Bellew was showing some decent defensive skills early on, rolling and slipping punches. Cleverly was more cautious than he was in the first fight. He was obviously mindful about this supposed extra power that Tony Bellew has. A cruiserweight, especially coming off that devastating knockout defeat he had to Kovalev a couple fights ago. So he was a lot more cautious. It was a lot more technical in the early part of the fight than the first fight was. And the strange thing is Nathan Cleverly wasn't throwing any right hands. It became apparent after a few rounds that Cleverly wasn't throwing the right hand. He was just throwing left hands and left hooks. But as the fight went on, the frequency of the left hooks from Cleverly even dropped off. And all he was doing was moving around the ring, flicking a very light jab. There was really nothing to stop Tony Bellew coming in at him. And in the first half of the fight, Cleverly wasn't exactly applying pressure, but he was at least standing his ground. In the second half of the fight, he was just flicking light jabs. He was on the back foot. Bellew was chasing him around the ring, pinning him on the ropes. And in the last few rounds, there was moments where, in fact, there was a couple rounds where Cleverly spent the entire round on the ropes with Bellew just pounding away. And it wasn't particularly good work from Tony Bellew. It looked sloppy. He looked slow. He didn't look particularly impressive at all. He said after the fight that he'd had a very long camp and he was tired and he didn't feel that sharp. And certainly in the second half of the fight, he didn't look that sharp at all. In the first half of the fight, Bellew looked okay, not especially sharp, but he was okay. The second half of the fight, he looked really sloppy, really slow. And yes, he did outwork Nathan Cleverly, but he didn't look like a world-class cruiserweight in there. And going into the fight, I didn't think either one of these guys was a world-class cruiserweight. They've certainly not proved they were world-class cruiserweights. And there was definitely nothing that I saw in this fight that convinced me either one of them is. So in the end, it was a pretty disappointing fight and a very disappointing pay-per-view. Very, very disappointing. I'm going to do a separate video on my reaction to the pay-per-view overall. And I wanted to give Eddie Hearn the benefit of the doubt because he said, look, watch the pay-per-view first. If you don't like it, give me stick afterwards. So I reserved my judgment beforehand. I wasn't one of these people who was coming out and bashing Eddie Hearn straight away. I said, no, let me watch it first and then we'll see. Because I didn't know some of the opponents who some of his fighters were going up against. I didn't know maybe they were really good opponents I just hadn't heard of. Well, it didn't turn out to be that way. The main event certainly wasn't pay-per-view worthy. None of the fights on the card were pay-per-view worthy. Very few fights on the card were exciting or anything like that, other than maybe the James DeGale fight. Andy Joshua did his thing. We know he's a work in progress. But overall, very disappointing pay-per-view. I'll do a separate video on it. But as far as the main event, disappointing, poor quality punches from both men. Cleverly just leaning on the ropes in the second half of the fight, not really throwing anything. Bellew unable to finish him, unable to do anything with him. Cleverly, both Cleverly and Bellew did show, I suppose, fairly decent defensive skills with slipping and rolling with punches and whatnot. So I'll give them that. But overall, it was poor. Marco Huck is going to wipe the floor with either one of these guys. If he fights Tony Bellew, he's going to wipe the floor with Tony Bellew. If Tony Bellew thinks that Adonis Stevenson was strong and hit hard, he is in for a rude awakening if he fights Marco Huck. A rude awakening, because Marco Huck is on a whole different level of physical strength and he can punch very hard as well. So obviously Tony Bellew has to go for that fight. This is prize fighting. He's got to go out there and earn for his family and do as much as he can while he's still in boxing. But on that showing, I don't think he's got a prayer against Marco Huck. So the interesting thing is, after the fight, watching the fight, it appeared to everyone that Cleverly had hurt his right hand. The commentators mentioned it. I was thinking it. Most people on Facebook were saying it. But after the fight, Cleverly didn't mention anything about hurting his right hand. Maybe he didn't want to look bad in front of the crowd and the audience by making an excuse. So maybe that's why he didn't mention it. But it was strange to me that he didn't. Bellew said that it's been a long camp and he felt tired and what have you. So he was kind of admitting that he did look a bit jaded. Eddie Hearn said it was a great finish to the fight. The Sky commentary team was saying it was a great finish to the fight. It wasn't. The crowd was obviously pro Bellew and they're going to cheer anything that Bellew does. But the reality of it was a pretty poor fight and a very poor card. Disappointing, disappointing, disappointing. Again, I'll do a separate video on the pay-per-view itself, but I seriously hope Eddie Hearn and Sky revise their policy on pay-per-view after this, because this was not up to par at all. So drop your comments below. Let me know how you felt about the main event and the scoring of the fight. I've got no idea what one of the judges was smoking who had it for Cleverly, because it was clearly a Tony Bellew fight. He clearly won the fight by at least 2-3 rounds. So there was no dispute there. Cleverly and Bellew both talked about a rematch, a third fight. Does anyone really want to see a third fight? Maybe the fanatical casuals who like Bellew and like Cleverly would want to see a third fight. I don't want to see a third fight. I didn't really want to see a second fight, to be honest with you. And God, another fight at the Millennium Stadium, because that's what Bellew was talking about. If he can fill out the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff, he'll go to Cleverly's backyard and fight him there. I don't want to see these two guys fight each other again. But drop your comments below. Let me know how you felt about this fight and the whole card in general. This is Hatman. I'm out.